It's me again, Bellamy Rhea. Hold your applause, please. Oh no. You might recognize me from FD's video on a certain comedian. But Foreign invited me here after inviting several other black trans women. Um, I was like last in line. He invited me here to talk about my experience with gender, and I think what I have to say is going to illustrate what his point is, or at least what I think his point is, very well. Um, what I'm going to try to do is explain my experience without analysis. That's something you might get over on my own channel sometime in the near future. Wink, wink. But today, I just want to explain what my life has been like and let foreign man do his thing in the foreign land. So, it's important for me to give you a fairly complete picture of my racial, national, and ethnic history because these things are inseparable from my gender. I think a lot of folks miss this understanding because they exist as someone who isn't forced to confront the racialization, even though we're all racialized, and get lost in gender metaphysics without looking at how gender is impacted and shaped by your race, nationality, and/or ethnicity. So, with that said, I want to ask you all to keep something in mind while I'm speaking. Race and gender, as we understand it today, are the result of colonization. They are constructs to make us all into easily understandable, easily commodified, and easily controlled subjects. The words I am using here are poor approximations from my experience. As Julesy said in her video on Cardi B, the language we need to understand these things does not exist. So, I'm the child of a black mother and a Japanese and white father. My mother was born and lived most of her life in a majority black neighborhood, while my father was born to a Japanese mother and a white American father in the suburbs of the very same city. The economic split between them is stark. My father, thanks in part to who he married, lives in a comfortable middle class home in a white middle class suburb. My mother lives in the same city as I do and doesn't own a home. Their lives, in many ways, are polar opposites. However, they share two experiences. One, they've both been the targets of virulent and often violent racism, and they are both my parents. I'm saying this way because a lot of people would consider me biracial or mixed. However, I have only really experienced my life as a racialized black person. People do not know that I have a non black parent unless I say something, and if they do, they don't mention it often. It's only after I make this known that my racialization shifts. For that, I'm going to call myself black for the duration of this video, although I have a lot of thoughts I'd like to express on that later. So it's here that I have to mention that I am not dark skinned. Depending on the day, it's debatable if I'm medium or light skinned, so I call myself light skinned to avoid arguments. For curious parties, I use NARS Medium Dark 2 Foundation. I don't know what color I would use if it were summer because we've been a panorama for 2 years now. So when I talk my. Wow, really? Did I just do that? I did that. So when I talk about my experience, I need you all to keep this in mind. For one, my experience is only mine and isn't transferable to others. But secondly, my experience, because of colorism, is going to be different than a dark-skinned trans woman who faces barriers that I do not. I shouldn't have to give a rundown of how colorism impacts these folks, and for that, I won't. You need to listen to them. So it's because my parents are who they are that my experience with gender is so peculiar, I think. I don't think it's terribly different from other black trans women in my economic position, but there are, and here comes Obasan, Khadijah's favorite word. Obasan means aunt or auntie, but there are nuances present because of who my parents are that need to be expressed. My father didn't have to work nearly as much as my mother. This isn't to say that my father is not hardworking. He certainly is, and is where he is in large part because he busted his ass for 40 plus years. However, he did not have to do with what my mother did to support his children. For most of my childhood, my mother worked 3 jobs. This is not to say that she wasn't present, because she was, but the truth is, she worked 4 jobs. She was working 3 for paid labor and then had to be a mother and a father to her 3 children. I say that because when I was not with my father, she had to fulfill these roles for myself and for my brothers. I wish I could say she got a break whenever I was with my father, but I'm not sure if that's true. I certainly hope it is. I'm telling you this to say, not to excuse, but to say that I wonder if her lack of time and energy did not give her the opportunity to stop and think about how she was raising her children. We were beaten, and in part because she's a religious person, she and my brothers were very homophobic. If I did not adhere to the expected norms of masculinity, then I'd at the very least be called homophobic slurs, if not have the wrath of God invoked as punishment for my behavior. When my mental health issues began to surface as a teenager, I expressed suicidal ideations, and my mother would say, "Go ahead if you're that weak." Those are really heavy things to do to a kid, and I learned very quickly to suppress, not hide, but to suppress those parts of myself. They did find very clever ways to express themselves, however. My love for flowers is one of these. I remember, if anyone remembers Need for Speed Underground and Underground 2, I put a massive rose sticker on the side of one of my cars and was lightly ridiculed for it. My arms are covered in tattoos of flowers, because at least tattoos are masculine enough to help obscure their perceived femininity. On the other hand, my father was very forgiving and open in his acceptance of me. He didn't restrict me. He struck me one time, I think, and cried immediately after. He never did that again. And for all of his flaws, anger being the largest one, he's very gentle. So I felt safer around him. Safe enough to just tell him who I am, whereas I had to give my mother reading material ahead of time and restrict our means of communication to avoid dealing with excessive othering. To her credit, she's been trying, but I never had any fear of this from my father. Talk of names and pronouns came with immediate acceptance and a noticeable shift in language. Additionally, the coercion and violence I experienced in public was violent. Yeah. My masculinity was regularly physically challenged. Fortunately, this wasn't it didn't really happen through direct violence very often, although that did happen. But usually it happened through things like football and basketball. However, I was also ridiculed by my peers, and if they became aware of who my father is, he would drop me off and pick me up from my mother's house. This ridicule increased because not only was my perceived lack of masculinity in question, but my blackness in tandem with my masculinity was in question, despite not being much lighter than my older brother who had a different father than me. I can't jump. I can't get 2 feet over a credit card, y'all. I'm fast as hell, and I spent a long time getting very strong, but I can't jump. But to be clear, this did not come from any specific group of people. Everyone, irrespective of race or class, did this to me. This stuck with me as I aged, and I felt the need to not only perform masculinity in a stereotypical way, but also blackness in a stereotypical way. These 2 things were especially damaging for me in ways that I think that are present for others forced into black masculinity. But for me, I had an internal component forcing myself to be quote-unquote black enough. This urge was so powerful that in an act of violence, in an effort to quote unquote fit in or to be quote unquote black enough, as a teenager, I nearly went to prison for 25 years. I'd still be in prison today had the charges stuck. Not only did this prevent me from exploring myself and understanding who I am, but it made me dangerous to other people. I want to be clear. I am responsible for my own actions, but I would be painting an incomplete picture if I did not explain why. It's also not lost on me that the darker skinned man I was arrested with did go to prison for a year. I don't know what happened to the other man who was light skinned, but he went on the run. Honestly, it's nothing short of a series of miracles that I am where I am now. It's certainly a result of hard work on my part, but you can only get lucky so many times before it becomes evidence of privilege. And looking back, having a father capable of bailing me out of jail and to pay for a lawyer, and having a father with a house and a room available for me to move into enabled me to rebuild my life and separate myself from the expectations placed upon me. For me, this is not true for all black people. Black trans women are living their lives as women despite many of the same and additional barriers. But for me, having space away from my mother and space away from other coercive people where I could put healthy distance without fear of losing my relationships or being rejected by meaningful people in my life, it gave me the room I needed to realize myself. I felt free from the pressure and was able to hop on the non-binary bi to trans lesbian pipeline. I don't know if that's real. It's gotta be real. Everything's a pipeline. We're all just playing Super Mario. So here I am today after all of these experiences, learning about myself and who I am, or who I want to be, because I don't think we're ever done and growing or changing. And again, as Julesy said, as Julesy said, when it comes to race, we lack the language necessary to talk about who people are, and that's a direct result of colonization. Race was originally based entirely off of phenotype, and blackness was attached to dark skin. And it became a nebulous biological concept with the nonsense one-drop rule. And as I see it, gender functions much the same way. Colonial gender is this thing that was originally based mostly on sexual organs, or at least as I understand it. But these are phenotypical. Your sexual organs don't actually have to match the expected outcomes of your genotype. In other words, you can have a penis and not have a Y chromosome. Sex, which gender is derived from, is this nebulous, fake, social, biological concept. I mean, biology is... Listen, biology is a social concept too, but I'll talk more about... Maybe I'll talk about this epistemology some other time. But this is why I call myself a non-binary woman. I have some internal proximity to what we might call womanhood, but it's a poor approximation of my sense of self, thus non-binary. But even these words don't work. They're based on, again, colonial gender norms, when my gender is much more complicated. I choose to express my quote-unquote masculinity through my quote-unquote femininity, and there's not really a word for that. Even stud doesn't really fit my understanding of myself, because I don't see myself as a woman doing stereotypical masculinity. Again, the words don't exist. I can show you and you can experience me for who I am, but I can't describe it to you accurately. To give you some idea of what I mean, I don't know if you'll remember, but a few years ago, the photo of the big muscular bodybuilder sitting down and having tea with his daughter was all over the place. And he was an assumed masculine man doing a feminine thing, but no one called it feminine. And I don't really remember them calling it overtly masculine. It was something else. The same happens with this photo of the trainer Massey Arias. I don't know her personally. This is just my read of a photo of her. But she's clearly strong as shit, and she's muscular. But her muscles and her quote-unquote masculinity are expressed through her perceived femininity, and it becomes something else. Like, to me, this may not be true for her, but to me, it doesn't read as one or the other, and it doesn't read as a blend either for me. For me, it reads as one through the other, and the two things change and become something else entirely. But the language for this doesn't really exist, and so I'm scouring pre-colonial Africa and Edo period Japan for something that might be accurate. And I'm making peace with the idea that there may not be anything. And I'm okay with being illegible, but unfortunately, the world isn't okay with that. People want simple, universal definitions, but I don't think that's possible. And in trying to reconcile this issue, I think we end up just redoing colonization, kind of. Like when Simone Biles wore a dress and people commented on how manly she looked. And it's just like, she's doing a stereotypical feminine thing. And we want her to be read a certain way, regardless of how she herself feels. And all of this finally brings me to my daily experience. I've been on hormones for about a month and a half now, and my body is starting to change. Mostly in ways that are noticeable to me. Your girl's skin is soft as hell. But the changes make it harder internally for me to express myself in the ways that many people expect. Going outside is an event for me. I put things off like grocery shopping until the very last moment, because in order to go outside and to feel safe, I have to put on clothing and present myself as a man. And in some ways, this is like a privilege of sorts, maybe. I don't really view having to hide myself as a privilege, but that I can still do so without too much concern for being clocked is a tool available to me that may not be available to others. That said, it causes significant discomfort. I get sirred and treated like a man. I use male restrooms and try to get in and out as quickly as possible. But other times, when this isn't tolerable for me, and I want to present and be read as feminine, I have to deal with another anxiety. It's hard to explain, so I'll give you all an example. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a friend's birthday party. We were all vaxxed. We try to be responsible over here, don't get it twisted. But after I got dressed and looked at myself, I sat in my home for 20 minutes, planning out routes and what I might do if someone confronted me so I could walk to my friend's house. They live less than 3 blocks away. I was terrified the whole time. Truth is, I spend most of my day terrified of the outside. I'm fortunate enough to be financially stable, to live alone, and to be able to hide in my home, but the idea that I feel the need to hide in here out of fear is not fortunate at all. Which I'm gonna do. Like, y'all can't stop me. Just wait until these hormones do more like hormone shit, and y'all are gonna y'all gonna be shook. Wait, who? It wasn't Paul Blart. It was him in Hitch. You can't stop me. You can't stop. I had my arms up for that too. My arms were definitely up.